All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth Lord's Prayer class. Today, I'd like to talk about the second half of the Lord's Prayer that we didn't cover last week. But also, before I started the recording, we were just briefly talking about just how the Lord's Prayer can start to take on different feelings for us the more we say it. And interestingly, there's a gentleman I really like. His name is oh, now I'm going to get it wrong. I think it's Jonathan Swinton, but I may be saying it wrong. But he writes about dementia. He's a priest in England, and he is also a licensed medical professional to deal with dementia and other mental issues. And he writes a lot about prayer and dementia and prayer and special needs. And one of the things I think is interesting that he says is that often when we lose all other language, we can still pray. So they've found in Alzheimer's patients who are almost completely nonverbal, the things that they can do are say the Lord's Prayer, say some other prayers that they learned when they were young, and often sing the lyrics to songs that they knew when they were young. They say music is the final thing to go, but interestingly, prayer is one of those other things that sticks long after everything else, even a sense of self. And he's got a theory about that. He says that when we are interacting with folks who have dementia, we're getting a peer into the mind of God. And he's got a lot about that. It's really actually quite fascinating. But there's another theologian who has a slightly different attack, and he says it's because prayer becomes the language of our heart. And when we forget everything else, when we're in that moment where we can't think of any words, prayer comes unbidden if, and here's the big if we have made it an integral part of our lives before that point. And I think that's where this repetition of the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day thing throughout the course starts to get you. It starts to get to that point of the Lord's Prayer becoming this prayer that comes unbidden when you think to pray. You say it so often that all of a sudden it becomes the automatic prayer, which I don't think is wrong because it's the prayer that Jesus gave us. But let's dive in again and look at the words of the prayer and what those words mean. So last week we left off with on earth as it is in heaven. So this week I'd like to look at the next few lines there. Give us this day our daily bread. So what's interesting about this line is there's a scholar of language. Her name is Sarah Rudin, and she wrote a book called The Face of Water, where she looks at the linguistic roots of the words that we use from the Bible and what culturally those words would have meant. And she points out that actually the Greek says this daily loaf. And there's actually a lot of other places in Roman culture at the time where they use that exact phrase. And so we know what it would have meant culturally. And what it would have meant, and this might surprise you, is welfare bread, essentially, the government dole. They was also called the slave's wages and the slave's allotment. Now, obviously, the Jews were seen as a slave people in the Roman Empire. They weren't full citizens. They were less than. And I saw this on a History Channel. It was fascinating, and I would love to go see it in person one day. But they actually found one of these public kitchens in a city that they excavated in the Roman Empire. And basically what it was just a big U-shaped counter with all of these baking areas, and they would just have, you would have just walked up to the counter. It was an elevated counter, so you would have been looking up, and they would have handed you down a loaf of bread. And they know exactly what the loaf of bread looks like because they found the baking implements and they've made new ones. And it's fascinating because it's a large round shaped loaf that would have had a cross on it because they tied it with a rope. And if you were a Jew and you couldn't afford your own food, you would go there and they would give you a loaf of bread, and that was your food allotment for the day. So, give us this day our daily loaf literally means give us the food that we need to survive, but also this food that means that we're servants. And I don't think Jesus said that without thinking about it. Because remember, he calls us to be servants to one another. And there's another theologian. She's actually a Mennonite pastor, Melissa Florer Bixler. And she says that this daily bread, for her, reminds her of that one unique moment in the history of God's people where food was a pure gift, a pure act of love. And that's in Exodus, when they're fleeing and they get manna from heaven. And literally they had to rely on that manna daily for their life. And without it, they would have died. And I think both are good interpretations of that line. I think she's right to call on that reference to Exodus. But I think we need to remember what it would have meant to those Jews in that day, knowing exactly what that word meant and hearing Jesus use it in that way. That we're supposed to pray to God, give us our daily loaf. That would have been a powerful thing for them. And then the next line, and forgive us our trespasses. We've talked about this before, but Sarah Rudin says that a better translation is, as it is in some Bible translations, forgive us our debt. And she makes a good argument for this, and again is referring to the fact that the Jews were a subjugated people. And if you fell behind in your payments, they could take you in front of a judge and demand that you be made a slave until you had repaid your debt. And so when we say slave in the Bible, there's actually like 3 levels of slave. But the most common one that we're dealing with is what we would today call a bond slave or an indentured servant. And essentially, they're just working off a debt. Their children aren't automatically slaves. They're not going to live as a slave their whole life unless they don't pay off their debt. But this is one of those fears that all of them would have held at the time, that they would go into debt and someone would demand that they be made a slave until they paid off that debt. And again, because they were a subjugated people, they weren't Roman citizens, that could happen to them very, very easily. And so, forgive us our debts is not just God forgive us our sins, it's God, literally, can you help other people forgive us our debts? Can you help other people not demand that we be made slaves to pay back what we owe? And then the next line, in the Greek, she points out that it actually says, even as we have let go the debtors of us. And she points out that what this really means, if you were to really get into the translation of it, it means that we have to forgive first before we can be forgiven. Only once we've forgiven, and not before, can we expect this forgiveness from God. And she points out that, sadly, in the King James Version, when this was translated, they didn't keep that part in. But in the original Greek, it absolutely says that, both in Mark and in Luke. Or Matthew and in Luke. And so I think it's important that we talk about that. We kind of touched on it briefly before, and I've talked about it in sermons, that Matthew really does make a point of saying that you have to forgive others in order to be forgiven. And she's saying that if you really look at the Greek, this prayer supports that. It says, as we have already forgiven others, basically, their debt. So forgive us our debt as we have already forgiven others their debt. And this next line, she says, is the most horribly mistranslated line because, and lead us not into temptation. She says this is a very specific Greek word, and the Greek word is, let me find it, periasmon. And she said that had one meaning, and only one at the time of Jesus' life. And the meaning was this. Again, these are not citizens. Now, if you were a citizen and somebody accused you of a crime, you would get to go in front of a judge and lay your case, just as Paul does, and we see in the Acts of the Apostles, right? But if you were not a citizen, hi. Great, thank you. If you were not a citizen, then you were liable to temptation. Now, temptation, periasmon, what this was they would drag you, and they would beat you, and they would tell you to confess. Until you would confess, essentially, to whatever they wanted you to confess to. They would whip you, they would humiliate you, they would torture you until you confessed to whatever crime they're saying that you had committed. So lead us not into temptation. She says, literally what you're saying is, please lead us, A, not to be accused of something that we haven't done. Let us not be the victim of gossip and of idle chatter that gets us in trouble. And then if we are, please God, let us not be tortured until we admit we've done it when we haven't. Please. That's really what this line is saying. And so when we talk about, in the Christian church, how it's not good to have idle chatter, it's not good to talk about each other behind, our backs. It's literally in the Lord's Prayer in this line, lead us not into periasmon. And then the next line, but deliver us from evil, she says that but is very important. And she says, actually, a better translation would be at least don't let us fall to the devil. At least that. Even if we do suffer temptation, at least don't let us fall to the devil. And she said, a lot of times it's not translated that way, but really that's the intent of the language. And that makes sense of those next lines that get added on. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. She says that for really is more of a because you have this kingdom and you have power and you have glory, and that's how you're going to keep the devil away from us. Because of that. Now remember, those lines are not something Jesus said in either prayer, in either section. Those were added on later. And that last line, forever and ever, amen, she says is even more beautiful in the Greek because it translates as, and I want to get this expression right because it is really pretty. It translates as into the ages of the ages. Forever. Essentially, right? But in a very beautiful way, into the ages of the ages. Like, we can't even imagine it yet. It hasn't happened, but that's how long you're going to have the kingdom and the power and the glory. Which is a beautiful idea. I think it's more poetically pretty than forever. I don't know. I mean, it means the same thing, but So I mentioned last week that when you learn these things of what it culturally would have meant, it's a little shocking. So I'm sure you have some questions.
So how do we use or deal with nowadays, lead us not into temptation?
Mm.
There's the contemporary version that says, save us from the time of trial. Is that supposed to bring us up to date?
Well, I mean, it gets to the same kind of idea, right? But it still pushes it off and makes it seem less horrible than it really was. Um, I think if we just can consciously think of it as save us from being falsely accused, right? Save us from being punished for something we haven't done. That's really the intent there. And it makes so much more sense if you know that when you think of the martyrs, right? Because what were the martyrs said to be? What did they call themselves? Do you know? They were confessors of Christ. They confessed. So they were led into temptation. They were whipped. They were beaten and told to confess. And they did. They confessed that they followed the Christ. And they were killed for it. But it makes so much more sense when we think of it in the sense of that lead us not into temptation, that they would be called confessors. Because otherwise it sounds kind of pretentious, right? Like, well, I confess I love Christ. Well, okay, great. But when it's in the context of that or death, right? Like, well, okay, well then it's a pretty serious thing. You're confessing to a crime that you know is going to lead to death. Um, and you probably have already gone through temptation before you confessed, right? Because even if you were planning on confessing right away, they probably got a few good licks in right up front. What other questions do we have?
So the part about we must forgive first
Mm.
before we can be forgiven,
Mm-hmm.
that's a toughie.
It is. It is. But again, it's exactly what he says in Matthew, right after he gives them the Lord's Prayer. I mean, it's not like I'm just pulling this out of the air. This is literally what Jesus said. So it's tough, right? Because we want to forgive, we want to just understand this as, well, we don't have this responsibility to forgive. God's just going to forgive us as long as we ask for forgiveness. And I think that's true, but it gets into the trickiness of how time and God interact. And let me step out of the Lord's Prayer very briefly to explain what I mean by this. So, according to the theology of the second coming and death, this is the Episcopal Church's official understanding. On the one hand, we say that we believe that the dead will be raised at the second coming and that Jesus will judge everyone at the second coming, right? And everybody who believes will be taken to heaven. On the other hand, we also believe that if you're baptized, if you're saved and you die, that you go immediately to heaven. So how do we square the two? And what the church fathers have said since almost the very beginning was that, well, once we die, we're in God's time, not our time. And God's time has to be different because God has existed since the beginning and God exists all the way to the end. And he's present at all points in between. So maybe in some way that we can't understand while we're alive, both things are true. We aren't judged and don't go to heaven until the second coming. And also, as soon as we die, we are judged and go to heaven. Both. And it's really tricky. And it's not something I would talk about with to somebody who's just lost somebody. But that's literally what the theologians have said, and it's what the church teaches. And so I think forgiveness falls into that same weird gray area where God expects us to forgive others, and we're supposed to do it. But I also think God forgives us immediately as soon as we contritely ask for forgiveness. And by contritely there, I mean the traditional definition that the church uses is with sincerity and intention to not do it again. Or as we like to say it, which is so much more PC, with intent on amendment of life, which just means you're promising not to do it again. So I think both. I think, yes, we do have to forgive first because that's what Jesus said, and I have to take what he says seriously because that's my job. But also I believe in God's mercy and forgiveness. And so I also believe in the right of reconciliation and penitence, which says that if we stand with a contrite heart before God and ask for forgiveness, I have the power as the priest to forgive you of all your sins. And how can I have that power if it's dependent on you forgiving other people? Because I think somehow both are true, and we just can't see it in our understanding of time.
That
But I
makes
really
sense
do
now.
believe that God puts that duty on us to forgive others, and that we really do have to do it, and not just say we do it, but mean it. And I don't know exactly how that works, but maybe, as Paul says, we'll figure it out after we're dead, you know? We see through dimly now, through a mirror darkly, but in the end we shall see face to face. I hope so. I don't know. But I believe. Great
That
question.
that makes sense. It's beginning to penetrate this thick brain.
And no, those are really tough existential questions, both of them. So, I don't know. That's my answer. What else?
Hearing what you say about give us this day our daily bread and how that culturally came to be, that that answers a lot of questions too about the role of what's necessary in life and how God provides that.
So
That's good.
there's a great prayer that same Mennonite pastor wrote in this paper that I read about this manna in the wilderness, and that being that one pure act of love when food was just purely a gift. She says, "When you pray, give us this daily bread, ask, what bread and what grace from God do I need this day? Am I satisfied truly with what God has provided? And can I pray this petition with complete honesty? Does anything in this position give me pause, convict me, push me deeper into obedience or humility? Listen to the voice of God's unconditional love."
That's very powerful.
So maybe next time you're praying the Lord's Prayer, when you hit that line, you'll remember that, or some part of you will remember a piece of that, and you'll think, give us this day our daily bread, and then you'll pause and you'll think, do I think I've gotten my daily bread today? Can I really say that? Have I gotten everything that's needful? Am I really grateful? Right? Like, it's once you know what all these lines mean, you begin to really struggle with them and think, I don't know if I'm praying this prayer with all sincerity. And I've told my spiritual director that ever since I took this class and I really delved deeply into this prayer, that I'll stick on a line. I'll just stop in the middle of the prayer and I will just sit there with it and think about it, and I won't continue the prayer. And I said, do you think that's okay? Is that wrong? Is that bad? And she said, I think anything that brings you deeper into contemplation with God, God is pleased with. Which I like, not only because it gets me off the hook, but because I think it's probably true. I think any time that just as we go through our day, we can pause and have a deeper contemplation of our relationship with God or God's nature. I think that's all to the better. And it's only going to improve our relationship with God and therefore our relationship with everyone else. Linda, do you have any comments or questions?
Um, I feel inadequate to even come up with questions. um, I think what you've just said about our daily bread and to thinking in terms of everything that we need and to really be, I mean, that has gone through my mind as I have prayed it, thinking it definitely doesn't just mean bread like in that you
Right,
toast. It
right.
definitely means everything that you need. And we need to believe, we pray, ask for that, and we're almost forced to believe that because God gives us, answers our, does answer our prayers, that He is providing us what we need. So as you mentioned, am I satisfied with that? Mm-hmm. That's a very convicting question to ask ourselves.
Yeah, and I've mentioned before that one of my favorite expressions is I can't say for certain that every good thing in my life comes directly from God, but on the other hand, it seems rude to think of it any other way. So whenever we do have something good happen in our lives, I think it's okay and appropriate to just say a quick thank you for it. Even if it was something that somebody else did for us. I think it's still okay to quickly thank God for that person doing that thing for us. And I think that puts us in a different frame of mind. I think praying this prayer every day for me, one of the things that it's done for me is really to change me into a more thankful person, to really put me in a different position in my relationship with God. This prayer really calls on us to think of ourselves as servants. And considering that that's something Jesus desperately wanted us to do, is to think of ourselves as servants of one another, I don't think that's unintentional. But I think when I pray this prayer, it reminds me of that. And it reminds me to ask myself, how have I helped someone else today? Or as if you've ever read the Mitford series, the prayer he starts the very first book off with, how can I be a blessing to someone else today? And I started praying that prayer initially kind of, I don't know, it seemed frivolous and kind of silly to me. But as I prayed it, it became very serious. And I started noticing that I was looking for people to be a blessing for. And I think that's one of the main things that Jesus was here to do, was to help us shift our thinking and to get us to see God's kingdom so that we could bring it on earth as it is in heaven. See God's kingdom all around us, already what God is doing. And if we can do that, how much easier is it for us to come alongside the work God is already doing and to just put our shoulder to the grindstone, as it were, and just help?
This is very good.
Thank you. All right, so we do have an assignment. Homework. This one is a fun one. And I am blatantly saying that I am stealing this from my teacher from this class, and she blatantly stole it from the upper room, if you know that publication. And this is actually a great experience, a great thing to do with teens who are reluctant to do prayer. And here's the exercise. I want you each to, it's a 2-part exercise. You can do 1 part this week and 1 part next week. The first part of the exercise is to write down an opposite prayer to this prayer. So for every line, write an opposite. So I'm just going to give you an example of the very first line, and I'm not going to cheat by giving you more. But instead of "Our Father who art in heaven," maybe "Our absentee parent who is nowhere." And I want you to write the opposite of every line. And I'm not going to tell you why, but maybe you'll get it and we can talk about it next week. Actually, that's the only assignment I'm going to give you this week. I'm going to save the other one for next week. Next week, we're going to do a little bit of a wrap up, and then I'm also going to share with you a couple other resources, and we'll field any other questions, and I'll give you your last assignment, which is really just kind of a take-home thing to do for yourself for fun, but it is fun. All right, so keep up with your daily prayer if you can. Lord's Prayer 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night, and write your opposite prayer, and we will talk about that next week. You don't have to share it if you don't want to, but I do want to talk about your experience of writing it and maybe what you've gotten from it. Thank you both for showing up for the class and giving me someone to talk to, so I'm not just talking into a camera. And I'll see you both later. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.